welcome to Something to Talk About. I'm Linda McNamee, and as you saw from our introduction, we are going to talk about a pretty serious topic, well, a very serious topic, but hopefully it will be. And anyway, we will be talking about Samaritans' hope and hope for individuals, hope for our community, hope for our society, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. I would like to invite you, if you have a question or a suggestion for a future topic, you can always email me anytime at talk@bcattv.org. Or if you have a question that you would like to present to our wonderful guest, whom you will meet momentarily, you can always you can call us tonight at 781-270-9199. We are accepting calls this evening. I would like to thank the crew for this evening, John Vias and Chris Flaherty, who are staff members here, making sure that everybody stays happy and healthy and remain on the air. And I would like to thank my husband, Paul, for staying home for Daddy Date Night in anticipation of our first day of school tomorrow. So now I would like to introduce you to our wonderful guest. We have Kathy Marchi. Marchi. Oh, you told me that.
It's okay.
Kathy, who is the Executive Director of Samaritans Incorporated. And thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm really interested and curious about the work that Samaritans does normally, as well as during our current state of being in a global pandemic.
Sure.
But before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, how you came to the Boston area, if you're not originally from here,
Right.
and what made you to decide to get involved in suicide prevention?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me and for talking about this topic. It's a hard one, as you said. It's a serious one, but if we don't talk about it, it's part of the stigma that is attached to suicide and mental health concerns, and it's part of what we think makes it harder for people to reach out for help. So just by having this show and by talking about it, we're doing a good thing. Tomorrow is the World Suicide Prevention Day, so this is the eve, a very good eve to be talking about this topic.
We'll need to talk about that
a little more
itself
about that.
a little bit more.
For sure.
And you also mentioned that September is
Suicide Prevention Month. So it's, just trying to bring focus and attention to the topic.
Okay.
To answer your question about me, I grew up in the New York City, New Jersey, northern New Jersey area. I did for-profit and nonprofit work for most of my professional career in the New York area. And then when we moved to Massachusetts for lots of really good reasons, when we got here, I felt like it was time to just plant myself in the nonprofit world, and very happy to do so. My connection to the world of suicide prevention came in 2014. I was working on some federal grants in support of work for children, youth, and families in Newton, and where I was both we had two kids who were in high school at the time, and so I was working on children, youth, and families in the community where I lived, and we had 3 teen suicides in a very short space of time, and in that moment, we activated people like me who were doing work, social workers, the school system, health and human services, came together to figure out what we would do to stabilize the community and support the families and children in the community. One of the organizations we turned to was Samaritans, and they came in to help us provide both grief support services for the families and the friends of children who had lost someone, but also to help us figure out how do we talk about this and what's the prevention piece. And through that work, I felt that I had learned a lot, and that I felt very committed to doing my part where I could to change this dynamic around mental health. Then I took a little detour and did some other work, and when the opportunity
always a detour,
but all good, and this opportunity presented itself, and I was just beyond thrilled to have the opportunity to lead an organization that was not only well known and doing incredibly good work, but it was really poised and positioned to do even more, to be able to just continue its impact. And I would say that starting in December 2019, so 9 months ago, it's been a very challenging time to be a new leader, but I will say that I'm really thrilled that I'm there and really impressed and honored to be working with this team that is just doing such great work to help people in Massachusetts.
Excellent. Now, I'm already going to go off topic, but when you were talking about the suicides that took place in Newton a few years ago, was that linked to bullying? Because I kind of remember about that time frame was when cyberbullying and bullying just really explode isn't the right word, but it really seemed to come to the forefront of our community at the time.
So what I would say about bullying is that, while it's an incredibly painful thing for a person to go through, not just children, but especially for children, none of those situations are the reason alone for suicide. Generally, I mean, there's always exceptions, but what we understand is that it's the sort of, again, for lack of a better term, the perfect storm of things that come together, right? So it might be bullying. There may also be depression, an undiagnosed.
It's like the straw that broke the camel's back type.
Multiple things, and the confluence of those things is usually the piece that, one more thing. What that leads us to, and what we also understand is that when we can help to sort of break that apart and help people with those individual pieces, that's how we can help people and avoid sort of reaching that point, right? So if we're dealing with the mental health concerns that somebody has, whether it's an undiagnosed mental health disorder, or it's abuse or neglect, or it's a substance use disorder. So there may be other things happening. If we could talk about those things separately and before they reach that point, then we have a much better chance of being able to help somebody.
Now, how or when, I'm not really sure what word to use, do people approach and ask for help with Samaritans?
Yeah. So
are they referred to? Do they just pick up the phone and say, oh my gosh, I'm having a really hard time here? How does that?
How do they get to us?
Yeah.
So Samaritans is most well known for the 24/7 hotline, helpline that we run. It's call or text, and I think you're going to share the phone number, but I will share it, 877-870-HOPE. And that then the numbers are 4673.
Okay. Good. Hey, I always get confused with phone numbers that spell things.
Yes, right. It's 877-870-4673, so that people know. So people most often call or text us. Sometimes people will be referred in the sense that someone in their life, a therapist, a friend, a family member might say, you should really try calling them. And what happens when they call us is that we have trained volunteers who will answer and provide a compassionate, non-judgmental listener. And really the idea is to help people talk through what's troubling them. Most people who call us are not imminently suicidal. It's quite often that people are calling to say, I'm experiencing bullying, or I just had this terrible fight with my mom and I don't know what to do, or my best friend said this. And so they'll talk through what's troubling them, and what that allows is that open conversation about why that's so painful and why that's difficult, and having someone say, I get that, right? I understand that that's really, really hard for you. Tell me what that feels like, and being able to share that.
And sometimes just having somebody to listen is so important, because we live in such in a world where everything is so separate and everything just
you're
having a real person
right.
to talk to sometimes would help a lot.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And sometimes people call us who are really despairing and lonely, and without reaching someone or without being able to talk to somebody, there's no way for us to know how that might escalate or change, but it certainly does provide them. And I've been on listen to calls, so in a learning shift,
Okay.
and listening to people say, I'm so glad you were there to listen to me, and thank you for helping me through this or through tonight or whatever was happening for them. So I think you're exactly
So it kind
right.
of makes your efforts worth it. You're like, okay, I'm doing something right.
Absolutely.
I'm doing something good.
Absolutely. We know that people, we have quotes all the time. People will say, thank you for doing this program, or thank you for being there. Because of you guys, today will be a good day, something like that. So we're really grateful when people share with us their feelings.
Now, you just mentioned program.
Yes.
There's the 24/7 hotline.
Right.
What are some of the other programs or outreach initiatives? I know that's at the end, but that Samaritans provides.
Yeah, so we have 3 things that we do. The
Okay.
helpline, we do suicide prevention workshops, and those are designed for the audience that we're talking to. So it could be for youth, it can be for adults, it could
Okay.
also be for veterans, firefighters,
Okay.
nurses, whomever. As an audience, we welcome inquiries for people to reach out to us and say, would you do this suicide prevention workshop for my youth group, or for my faith-based, or my book club, or
Okay.
whatever it is. We're doing a lot of them, doing them all online now.
We kind of have to do virtual right now.
And we're doing them, open to the public. Sharon Public Library did one, and just it was open. They pushed it out in the community, and we had a nice group for that. So the idea there is that we'll talk about risk factors. We'll talk about what to do if someone, is expressing concerns. What are the steps you take? What are the things you say? What are some of the myths to dispel,
Okay.
and talk about? The other program that we run is grief support services for people who have lost someone to suicide. Those are, we have staff doing everything, but those meetings are run by people who have lost someone to suicide in support of others who have lost someone. And they're incredibly powerful. The grief journey for suicide loss is very unique in many ways. And so for people who have lost someone to suicide, the opportunity to talk to other people who have experienced a similar loss is really, really helpful. And when we can, we'll go out also either virtually or in person to have one-on-one meetings with people if they request those.
Now, I'm just thinking that friends of mine have experienced suicide of a family member. Both were very different circumstances. With these support groups, is it limited? Is there just a generic, if you've been affected by suicide, or is if you've been affected by a suicide of
this type?
type?
They are,
like suicide through
general,
bullying, suicide through
no, they're
mental
they're
health,
open to anyone, and so
Okay.
they are for adults, and they may be a partner, a child, a niece or nephew. It could be anyone really, a coworker. But it's an opportunity for people to really talk about what's different about suicide loss, and what are the factors that are different, like the feelings of guilt, or what should I have known, or that it's been 16 years and I still feel this pain. Why is that so? And talking with other people who have lost someone it's helpful for survivors in their journey.
Now, with these programs, do you partner with mental health organizations, or do you kind of have your all-inclusive staff on hand?
We do have our staff on hand, and we do partner where necessary and appropriate with,
or like the schools or
mental
for local
health professionals,
hospitals,
right?
Okay.
And certainly, we love to connect with schools and get in, and whether it's through a wellness program or a homeroom type class meetings. We've worked with bullying specialists to train adults, professionals. We'll work the program with the audience and really welcome the opportunity. So like I said earlier, if people, who are listening think, wow, I would be, I'd like to bring that to my program, we're happy to hear from them, because that's how we can get that, word out, that conversation. And
right. And kind of break down that stigma that we talked about.
That's right. Exactly. That's a big part of it. The conversation is really about opening up the conversation, right? This is not, we talk to young people all the time and say, talking about this, as hard as it might be, could save your friend's life.
Right.
And kids are often understandably worried that someone might be mad at them if they break confidence, or they, tattle on them. And, it's the alternative could be that we lose someone.
Right.
So, changing that feeling, that stigma, if you've probably used this example in your life with your kids, if your kid fell and broke their leg, you wouldn't be like, well, let's figure that out on our own, or you can handle
sometimes
that.
I threaten that.
You can handle that. You'll be okay. So we want to make sure that people think the same way about mental health concerns, and that they reach out when they need help, because that's what we need when we're struggling. We need somebody to help us figure it out.
Okay, I do want to delve more into the mental health aspect, but as we're talking about Samaritan's mission and goals, how has suicide prevention or awareness changed over the past couple of years? Is it no longer taboo, or are we still working on that?
Definitely still working on that. It's still very much a taboo topic. It's still very much, many of us grew up feeling like that is not something you would ever ask somebody how their mental health was. Were they thinking about suicide? So many of us grew up with those myths,
right,
that if we brought it up or suggested it, we might be suggesting it to someone. We might be encouraging them or giving them the idea, which we know is not true. And that's not how it happens.
Okay.
I wish that I could tell you that the suicide rates were going down, but they're not. They are going up, and that was
with
before
or without the
COVID.
Okay.
Exactly, prior to COVID. What I think we might be getting, what might be changing, is that we're talking about it more. There's still probably a lot of underreporting for various reasons, complications that might make it less certain whether it was a suicide or an accident or what have you. But I do think there's still a lot of work to do, really a lot.
So how has COVID kind of changed the direction?
Right, yeah.
Okay, that could be a show in itself. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question.
The stresses of being in a global pandemic is one thing, but then also having everybody confined. I've heard that, again, I don't know if it's, confirmed or not, but it seems like child abuse cases, spousal abuse, just domestic abuse cases have been on the rise, but aren't reported as often because of the situation. How has your work been affected by?
Right. Well, the phone and text line increases are substantial.
Have you had to add staff? Can you add staff?
So, it takes a lot of time to train people. We've been training volunteers very quickly. We had, sort of moved everything remotely very quickly, and then moved the training, which was 2 full weekends worth of in-person training, and then lots of shifts where you're learning. We moved all of that to remote. So the programs are running. The volume increase on the phone and text line has been very high. The text line, increase at some point was about 80%
Wow.
increase in text. And part of that, we think, is people are at home with people.
And they can't
talk on the phone. There are more stressors, like you said, being at home, sometimes in situations, required to be home in confined spaces, sometimes with people who are not treating each other well, or where the routines and the things that were in place before to help people cope were no longer in existence or possible, whether that was a program that they went to or access to support systems that they had before weren't in place. We know how hard this is on teenagers and on young people, but especially for teenagers, college, youth. They're designed to be doing something very different than the pandemic has allowed them to do. So they're really struggling with all of that. And, then on top of all that, as you said, is this sustained nature of this crisis is that, there may have been job loss, and then, savings have been utilized, and those are gone, and maybe there are concerns about housing or food,
and even healthcare too. It's like
access to healthcare.
How will I be able to?
How do I?
What happens if I get sick?
Right, exactly. What happens if I need to talk to somebody and I no longer have that insurance, or I no longer have access to the person who was helping me before, or the program that was helpful? So we do see that in prior times when we had crisis, we had some spikes, where phone volume would increase and come back down. But this is sustained over a much longer time.
Sustained.
Exactly, over a long period of time. And that's what people are feeling, right? The sustained pressure of all of this, and the constantly trying to figure out the newness of all of this. So, even children starting back to school, right? Everything that we might have, there are some butterflies and nervousness about starting school, but on top of that is also all of this is so different, and all of this is
I'm not
changed.
going to be able to see all my
it's
friends.
Familiar.
I won't be able to talk to my friends. I'll have to wear a mask,
Right. Everything that feels unfamiliar, and for people, who struggle with anxiety or any mental health concern, all of those things add to that scenario that we talked about before that could lead to an increase in that reaching that point of feeling like this is just really too much.
Right, okay. But a lot of times it seems like somebody might be prone to, or genetically going to have anxiety. But now it seems like it's just becoming more popular because of the situation that we're living in. So it's not like a genetic or hereditary thing. It's just a cultural. So you're being bombarded by both.
Right. And that's where we want people to call us, right? That's exactly it. It's just, this is making me feel anxious, and we're there to say, tell me more, tell me more about that. What does that mean to you? How can, how are you coping with that? What is it, what is that not being able to see your friends' faces or being, with your friends in the way you're used to? What does that mean?
Right.
And to just help people talk about that and think about, how they can, how they feel about it.
Looking at my notes, I'm just thinking, we've been talking for over 20 minutes now, and we keep saying, death by suicide or suicide awareness. Is that the correct terminology to use? I mean, I want to be able to talk about it, but I don't want to be offensive and make the problem worse by, so how do you bring this up? How do you talk about it politically correctly?
Right. And that's a great question, right? Because we all want to say things in a way that's helpful and and doesn't create or lead to perhaps making someone feel badly. So a couple of things. Yes, we say that someone died by suicide, or it was a death, suicide death. We say completed a suicide. We don't use the term committed, although you'll see it often, committed suicide. And we don't because, of course, committed sounds like a crime.
Okay.
And probably is rooted in that suicide was at a time.
Is it still considered?
It's not in a lot, not here, and not in a lot of places, but it was at a certain time.
Okay.
We also want, when we want to talk to somebody and ask them how they're feeling and what's happening with them, we want to be sure to be really clear about what we're asking so that people understand, I'm hearing and seeing that something's not right, and I want to ask you how you're doing, and probing a little bit and saying, I'm worried about you, and given certain signs, we would say to someone, are you thinking about ending your life? Are you thinking about killing yourself? taking your life. We want to be clear about the language. If we say things like, are you thinking of hurting yourself, right? Someone who's thinking about suicide might think, well, no, I'm not thinking about hurting myself. I'm thinking about ending this. The pain I'm in. I can't take this pain anymore, and I want that to stop. So the question, the clearer the question.
I'm not thinking about hurting myself. I'm already hurting. I'm trying to fix it.
Exactly, and I want this to end. And the other thing I would say is that when people answer those questions, to the best of our ability, and this is not easy to do, we want to be able to receive that information openly. So when someone says, yeah, I just want to end it all, we don't want to answer with something like, oh, don't say that. Yeah. You have so many great things in your life, or, I'm glad you said no, because if someone's trying to talk to us and trying to communicate with us and we answer in that way, as natural as that might be, and the desire to say, oh, don't say that, you have a great life, right? That's because I want you to live. I want you to realize what's good in your life, and I want you to live. The message may be interpreted as, wow, this person really doesn't want to hear what I have to say.
Okay.
Right?
What would be the correct response to something like that?
Yeah, tell me more. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. If you think someone is really imminently thinking about suicide, someone says to you, yeah, I'm so done. I'm just finished. I can't go on. You want to ask more questions, more concretely about, have you thought about taking your life? Yes. Have you thought about when you might do it? If the answer is yes, have you thought about how you would do it? So the more yeses you get, the more imminent, the more concerned you should be, and the more reactive we need to be, right? So then we might need to call 9.
Question. It's like, okay, what am I supposed to do with all? Yes, next Tuesday.
Right. So it's the shorter the time span of thinking about it, right? Yes, I just want this to be over, now, this weekend, soon. If somebody says, I've been saving my medication, I have lots of pills. Or somebody says, I think there's some pills in my house, right? It depends on where that scale is of things. In any case, where you feel concerned for someone's well-being, generally I would say don't leave them alone. Ask them if they would accept help. And if you need to, call 911 and explain the situation. But that's part of what we talk about in the workshops is sort of like how to understand those different situations. I think in general, my feeling is back in 2014 when we were doing the trainings in Newton, one of the things that someone said to us was, think of it like CPR, that you are the person on the scene. Someone's just, you've come upon someone, and you're going to do your job as a layperson to try to sustain life until the experts arrive. And so our job, right, is not to be the professional, but to say, wow, I'm hearing something that really worries me about you, and I don't want to leave you alone, or I want to make sure that we have access some other support or help for you before I separate, before I go my way. I want to make sure that you're talking to your therapist, or we've called 911, or you've agreed to, whatever the step might be to help.
I'm also wondering, as we talk, that this is assuming that the person wants to be helped. Right. And, can I help, or do you want me to help? Yes. What happens if they say no?
Yeah, it's hard, right? And that's where
I'm throwing all these.
No, they're hard. They're hard situations. There's nothing easy about this,
right?
And part of it is because we're not used to talking about it, which makes it harder, and also because there's not, to lots of the questions, there's not like a if it's this, go that way. If it's this, go that way. It's not that direct. So I would say with someone, and it certainly happens, where people say, no, I'm okay. I'm not thinking about suicide. I just really feel like I need to make a change, right? So then we talk about something different. If someone says to you, no, I don't want any help, and I do feel like this is too much to bear, and I don't want to go on any longer.
I've already made up my mind.
Right, I've made up my mind, or this is the path I'm taking. Then we do want to try to figure out what's the next best thing we can do, and is that mean calling? For young people, we say all the time, is there a trusted adult that you can reach out to. Again, if the need is there, to reach out to professional services, whether it's your own therapist, for suggestions on who else to call, if it's 911, if it's maybe not imminent, can I help this person talk to their, their healthcare provider, So.
Or DCF, or
Right. Sure, certainly.
or somebody
if there are other,
else that has the resources available.
Right,
Who
absolutely.
could probably
Yeah,
come up
social
with
workers in your town or your school. Absolutely.
Have we? Okay, yeah. Let's jump around here. Are there types? In the statistics, are there like stereotypical people who are more prone to suicidal tendencies? Like, is it a gender thing? Is it an ethnic, social, socioeconomic, religious? I mean, are there patterns that you can see?
Yeah. So the highest rates of suicide are in middle-aged men.
Okay.
More women think about suicide, consider suicide than men, but more men die by suicide. That's primarily because of the means chosen. The rise in suicide among youth is still alarming and concerning. It's even higher in the Black community, Black men and Black youth.
Okay.
There are also high rates in Native Alaskan and Native Americans.
Really? Okay.
Sometimes it's, again, the confluence of substance abuse, of isolation. There are higher rates in parts of the country where there is greater access to lethal means like guns, and isolation, and lack of healthcare resources. So if you talk about parts of the middle of the country where you might have multiple guns, be isolated, doing work that's isolating, not have easy access to mental health care.
Okay.
And
It's
add
the perfect
something
storm
else.
that
Right.
you're talking
Yeah, right.
about.
So add anything else.
Right.
Loss of a job, some other circumstance so there are some patterns, but what I will say is that suicide does not discriminate. It is a concern for everyone across the board, and something that the more we talk about, again, allows us to delve into the communities where it may still be more taboo than in other communities where there may be a little loosening of that. But for some, certainly in some communities and cultures, it's a lot harder to talk about. It is tied to shame or humiliation, embarrassing a family. There are cultural things that impact whether or not somebody could even think about talking about it. And we certainly have seen that happen, where people call and say there's no one in their family. They have lots of people in their life, but there's no one they can talk to about this.
Okay.
And part of that is the culture, So there are some patterns, but still.
Knows no boundaries.
Right.
Are there trends or statistics where drug and alcohol use are also related to suicide? I mean, not like prescription drugs taken correctly.
Sure.
I'm talking about, the substance abuse.
Yeah, there's a high correlation between substance use disorder and suicide for a couple of reasons. Again, is the substance use disorder coupled with something else? Is it masking something? Is there an undiagnosed mental health concern, self-medication? Sort of what's the combination of things that, again, drugs and alcohol may lower the inhibition around something like suicide, thinking around it. So there is, unfortunately, a correlation, but I think of it, again, as that perfect storm or the comorbidity of issues at play.
Okay. Now, on Samaritan's website, there was something called suicidal ideation.
Yep.
What is that?
Yeah, that's
the first
thinking
time I
about-
looked at it was like idealation. And I'm like, oh, it's
Yeah.
ideal, but
Yeah. No,
what is
it's thinking
ideal?
about suicide.
Okay.
It's when someone's thinking about suicide.
Okay.
And so, the way I've learned about it is, there may be a moment where somebody feels like this is just, like, I just can't take another thing, right? This is just a lot to deal with. But not yet thinking that therefore I feel like I would take my life.
Okay.
Right? So that's, many of us experience that feeling of like,
Calgon, take me away.
Yeah, I can't take another thing, right? Like
Right.
I just can't add anything else to what I'm already coping with. It's really, really hard. But have not thought about it and may never.
Okay.
Right? Many people will experience that feeling of despairing or isolation, sadness, but never experience that moment of I'm thinking about suicide.
Okay.
And so where people are is a continuum. It's not a here or there. Often it's these are the things happening, and the more that they're happening and the more intensely they're felt, and then the sort of add on or residual effects of things, right? So if I am dealing with a drug or alcohol problem, abuse of those substances, then maybe I've lost my job and now my family is really angry at me because I've lost my job and I'm creating this difficult dynamic. And on top of it, I have an undiagnosed mental health disorder. So there may be multiple things that are happening, and then that thinking towards suicide might deepen. And so what we hope is that people will reach out to Samaritans or to someone else that has learned some of these techniques and be able to say, this is all feeling like I can't, cope anymore. I can't deal with it, and being able to, think about that and talk about it and share their feelings about that, so that hopefully we can reduce
So
that.
kind of like break the cycle.
That's
and
right,
break that
exactly.
cyclical thinking
Yeah.
and say, okay, yes, these are problems, but
Yes.
what else what other things can we do to fix the situation?
Yeah. What other things do you do, have you done in your life that make you feel better when it's like this? What are the things that you do that work? And how can we help you, think about that?
Now, as you're talking, I'm, just kind of queen of tangents. We had mentioned earlier in our conversation that as a helpful friend, when you approach somebody, it's not like, what do you think, is everything okay? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? That's what it is. Are you thinking about hurting yourself? And the answer generally is no. Is there a correlation or a connection when someone is thinking of self-harm, and then if that doesn't work, they go that little bit further and start thinking about suicidal thoughts? Like the person who's completely overwhelmed and just like, okay, I can't take this anymore. I'm going to take enough pills to get me admitted to a hospital so I can get a break.
Yeah.
Versus I want to completely...
Right. Yeah. I think that we have to take all signs of when someone is expressing something, whether it is to do something like taking those pills, really seriously. So if somebody were to take a handful of pills, maybe not enough that might kill them, we have to take that seriously. If they're feeling like they might even think that might give them the break from what they're coping with, we have to take that seriously, and we have to think about that as a real attempt to alleviate some of their pain and a real desire to stop that pain and find a way out of it, which doesn't have to be suicide. Something that that therapists and people who have attempted suicide report is that there is that moment where that feels like the only option, but if we're able to interrupt that and we're able to help somebody at that time, they are most often never suicidal again. So they
okay.
reach a point, but once we figure out what's happening there, whether it's
Once you break that connection.
break that connection, figure out what's happening, is there a diagnosis and treatment that needs to be? Is there a situation that by changing it, an abusive or neglectful situation that if changed could help, and with the right support and the right guidance could help that person never reach that point again. Again, why we hope people reach out to us when they're feeling that way, because if we can help talk them through that moment or help them figure out how to get help for themselves, that they may never be suicidal again. So there's a great deal of hope.
Have since changed.
Right. That perfect storm is no longer, exactly, no longer happening in that same way. I've heard people say, it's a very preventable form of death. It's still the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, but it's very preventable.
Wow.
In the sense that if we can reach people in that moment, we can prevent that death by suicide.
Now, we've talked a lot about mental illness, underlying mental illnesses, but specifically concerning the pandemic or during this pandemic, does there seem to be an increase in suicide statistics where there is not a mental health issue?
It is almost always a mental health issue combined with something else. It's very, very rarely, I wouldn't say never, but it's very, very rare that it's one thing. I lost my job and I completed a suicide. It's very rarely that jump from one thing. There may be underlying, undiagnosed, right? That's sort of been masked for years or managed for years. It may be that those situational things might feel very overwhelming. I think oftentimes, people will look for that clue. It was he lost his job. She had this happen to her. People will look for some way to sort of understand how someone went from what seemingly was, she had a great life, things were going great, she had a great job, whatever it was. So then we don't know what happened. There was no sign. Often there are signs. We may not know them, and we may not have understood them to be signs. And
hindsight's always 20/20.
Right. It's a lot easier. And also, you don't know what you don't know, and that's why we do think about the programs and talking about suicide prevention, talking about those risk factors, and sort of talking to people about how to, what to look for. That's part of the way we can help prevent suicide, because if we see early on some of those signs, we might be able to interrupt that process and help someone get help. Things like, when we see someone give away a prized possession, my grandmother's ring, that I've just always, everybody knows how much I love that. And then all of a sudden I've given it to my sister. Or, want to find somebody to not watch my pet, but take my pet permanently. What are the things that might have been a clue earlier that for many of us we would miss because we just don't know what that might indicate.
Don't know what to look for, exactly.
Right.
So let's, we only have about 10, 15 minutes left. Can we talk about those who are those who remain? If I was trying to help someone and I wasn't successful, or not that I wasn't successful, but,
might have lost some. Yep.
What's the grieving process? Is it different than a regular death? Or what are the, let's talk about that victim.
Yeah. The impact of suicide on survivors is tremendous and can often be part of a lifelong grieving process. We have volunteers who work with us at Samaritans who have lost someone, 18 months ago and 18 years ago. So it's part of who they are. It's part of the, experience. People who have lost someone, a loved one, to suicide are at higher risk for suicide themselves. So we always want to think about that also. We very sadly will see sometimes, a parent and a child in the same family, and they may be a few years apart and they may be many, many years apart. But again, a higher risk. Like we said earlier, there may be guilt. There may even be, I think one of the reasons why talking to other suicides loss survivors is so helpful is that sometimes people even have a sense of relief after a suicide if they've seen someone struggling for a long time. And that feeling of, they're not suffering anymore and there's some relief. And as we know, grief, is a process, right?
The 7 stages.
Yeah,
Don't
it
ask me to name
moves,
7.
right? So, and this moves back and forth and in different ways even still. So I think it's a very difficult process. It's very unique. And oftentimes people will express some feelings of, it's been a year. People are expecting me to be over it. Or, she lost her husband. I lost my husband. I lost my husband to suicide. Why am I not feeling like her?
Right.
Why am I not in the same place that she's in now, a year later, 2 years later? It's a very different death and it's a very different experience. And so the loss is unique. And one of the things we try to talk to people about all the time is that process, that unique process, is your process. And that it will be yours until you've moved through to the place where you can make whatever strides or changes, feel right to you. And some people, it takes longer than others, and some people, have to loop back in it. Whatever that is, that's what you're entitled to. I think often, people express things like needing to not necessarily defend, but talk about their family and the loss. So, feeling like, that those parents weren't paying attention, right? They weren't, they were never paying attention to their kids, right? Like some comments that might make, really be incredibly hurtful.
Right.
But that's the stuff that people who have lost someone to suicide sometimes experience because it's still such a taboo topic that we don't necessarily understand it. And so,
how would, what are some of the ways, the work that you're doing is amazing, and we've talked about how we need more of it. How would someone go about supporting Samaritans?
Thank you for asking, because that's tremendous. So there are a few things. Our helpline is volunteer supported, so we, always need volunteers. We have a lot of wonderful volunteers with teams. So our office is our office was in Boston. Our office is still in Boston, but our volunteers are really helping us from anywhere right now. But there are national organizations, but ours is Massachusetts based. So people can help us on the phones. We love to have volunteers inquire. There's information on the website to start that process. That's a tremendous way to help us. And that could be phone or text. We'll train people for those processes. We, of course, are very grateful for donations and support. And we love when people reach out to us and say, as I said earlier, would you do this program for my business, for my company, or for my school? And another great way is to support the events that we do.
Which are?
Yes, we have one coming up.
Thank you.
Yes, segue. So Saturday, September 26th, we have our 5K. It is virtual. It's usually about 2,000. I know. It's usually about 2,000 people who do the 5K from Artisani Park in Brighton. But this year, we're inviting people to sort of walk 5K on their own. To develop their team, to fundraise and support Samaritans. We've got some fun stuff happening, like, podcast and a playlist, and, people can print out bibs, and we've got a scavenger hunt for kids, and, stuff like that to involve people. We'll still be doing fundraising prizes. We have an online auction with it, so people can support us through those mechanisms, whether they, join a team, walk, support a team, whatever that looks like. We do have a couple of other teams, things that we run during the year. Boston Marathon team We also have New York City Bibs this year, which again, hopefully will be happening next year. And then we have a big breakfast for hope in the spring, which is, again, a big gathering of people. This year was completely virtual. Maybe next year will be hybrid. But again, to celebrate and honor people who have lost someone to suicide and to bring people together again, to support our mission and help us prevent more suicides and save more lives. So we'd be grateful for any of the ways that people would feel comfortable.
Now, are these ways
connecting.
Listed on the website?
Absolutely.
For more
Yep.
information?
Everything is on the website. So, and the website's SamaritansHope.org. So people can find us. And like I said, welcome their inquiries and in any way that we can help them. And again, these are bracelets that we give out, when we're in schools. And, I've gone a couple of times. Yeah. And I've always been really happy when I see, I walk into a school, with the team, and you'll see some kid walk by who still has one on, from a previous session. So I'm always happy because we want to make sure that people have the phone number, and it's not something they have to go figure out what was the name of the organization.
Yeah.
We encouraged, when we were dealing in Newton with this situation, we encouraged, young kids to, kids all to put it in their phones. Just put it in your phone so that you just know it's there, and if you need it or a friend needs it.
And then your mom finds it and says, why
is that there, right? And the conversation is, hey, Mom, because in case I ever need it, I want to make sure I can reach someone for help, right? And ideally, Mom says, that's great. I'm glad you have that number.
Mom says, okay, what's going on?
Yeah, yeah, tell me more, right? Start that conversation, but certainly, I'm really glad you have that number. I'm really glad you know to call that. In the same way, I mentioned earlier very briefly that, there's a national 988 number, which will be,
tell me about that.
Yes, that will be the equivalent of 911, right? And ideally, what we hope is that when that number is launched, which is probably a couple of years out, but when that is launched, that many people will just know that number. You'll just know, right? 911 is fender bender, right? And 988 is a mental health crisis.
Okay, so it's all mental health.
All mental health. And so that while we want people to remember our phone number now, that they instead, at that point, will have only the number they will have learned from, 5 years old.
Exactly.
Right? 911 and 988. And they'll know those numbers.
Now, can we talk a little? I know you just said that it's not going to come out for a couple more years, but what was why did that come about? Or how did that come about?
Well, because there is no national way of reaching mental health support, right? So it's call your provider. If you don't have a provider, find what your community offers. What is your workplace offer? So that it's all
and if you're going
disparate.
through an emotional crisis,
right?
You really can't.
Figuring that out, right? In those, and there's a lot of great programs that are out there to help people figure that stuff out. And there are a lot of people working really hard to figure that out. But we know that 911 is the way to very quickly get the help you need in an emergency. And so we want the same thing to be happening for mental health crisis. And we think that will allow us to provide more immediate support and help to people more quickly and more appropriately.
Because I was wondering, if on the other end of that call, is it a healthcare provider or is this someone who has the resources available saying, oh, you're in this town, you can contact them? Or
there may be some direction.
Both,
because I think that
still 2 years away.
Right, and we're going to need to be able to respond to somebody who's in imminent crisis, in acute need for care. But there may be also that, what is the mechanism? So in the same way, we don't call 911 to say,
when is the garbage being collected?
Right. We want to call the, the appropriate number.
Or little kids calling, I need help with my homework. It is an emergency. It's
this
due
is
tomorrow.
my emergency, right? But we want to be able to get, we're hoping that number will help figure out what the tree of support would look like. But certainly it will provide immediate care or intervention for someone in a crisis.
Okay. Now, is Samaritans national, or is it just a Massachusetts thing?
Samaritans.
Yeah, I know. We should have talked about this.
That's okay.
50 minutes ago.
Yeah. So Samaritans was founded in Boston. The first one in the United States was founded in Boston by Monica Dickens, who is the great great granddaughter of Charles Dickens.
Oh, okay.
She was trained as a Samaritan in England by a church vicar who discovered that while people were waiting to talk to him, they would be greeted and chat with and talk with volunteers who were in, providing sort of help, right, in his in the rectory. And so he then discovered that what they really need is to talk to someone, and it didn't have to be him. So that's how Samaritan started. She then came to the United States, started the one in Boston where we're located. So we're approaching our 50th anniversary before long.
You guys gonna do something fun?
We hope so. We certainly hope by then we'll be able to do lots of things. And then other offices opened, and there are also others. There's 7, I think, in the United States.
Okay.
4 of which are in Massachusetts, New York, and I forget exactly where else. So they're around. They're all volunteer driven, like us, and there are other organizations certainly that answer calls for people who are struggling, and certainly the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is a national number, and that routes calls to people, to centers in the area where the call is originating.
So like a local resource.
Right. And so that we find to be important and helpful too, because again, reaching someone who is in even New England, right, might be easier to feel connected to that volunteer and have that person understand what I'm talking about than someone who might be located on the West Coast or, somewhere else. So, that's, again, another way of being able to just connect with someone and listen to them non-judgmentally and with compassion.
Right before we leave.
Yes.
The 5K.
Yes.
September 26th. Is it too late to start a team?
Not too late for anything. It's not too late to start a team, to join a team, to donate to somebody who's walking. The auction just launched today. Some really cool stuff. Are you still
looking for items, or?
Certainly, always. Yep, happy to put stuff on, because it's, again, all online, so it makes it easier to plug it all in
makes
there.
Makes it a little easier to handle.
So absolutely. So we'd be grateful for the support.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you.
As we are just about out of time. But I want to thank you because I did find, our conversation very encouraging,
good.
And hopeful, I guess if that's a word. So, but thank you very much. And
thank you.
I also want to thank everyone at home for tuning in this evening. And I hope that you are as inspired to give Samaritans a call, give them more hope, and together we could save the world.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. So we could start.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you very much for tuning in, and have a wonderful weekend. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you around town. Good night.